Welcome to the worst nightmare of all. Reality.
Explore the lesser-known stories of our unknown world. Join the pursuit of the paranormal with Ash and Greg.
Good evening, Ash. How are you?
Good evening, Greg. Very good. Eating lots of Easter eggs. It's Easter weekend. How are you?
I'm all right. I haven't had a single Easter egg yet. So, all good, though. All good. And the weather's going to be nice for the weekend in the UK, at least. So,
Yeah, I'm working every day, so I won't.
I'm off now for 4
See you.
days. So,
How do
4
you
day
get
weeks.
how do you get jobs like that? I'm in bloody weekend.
I'm 4 day weeks for the next 3 weeks. So, that'll do nicely.
Nice. Well, last week's episode, we kind of teased we're going to be talking about something a bit unusual, something that you may not kind of heard. It's sort of a sentence that you wouldn't really hear in any normal conversation.
I don't even think we even named it. We only put it on the chat
we didn't. Yeah.
for the people that were in the group with us. So.
So we will reveal it very shortly. But tonight's guest join us, very experienced cryptozoologist, author, journalist, conference speaker, travelled around the world investigating all sorts of different things, and that is Richard Freeman. Thank you, Richard, for joining us tonight.
Hello.
Thanks for having me.
Very welcome. So do you want to give just a bit of background on sort of how you got involved in the whole thing? I know you got a bit of educational background. You want to talk about that and how that evolved into your sort of paranormal investigations?
Well, how I got involved in cryptozoology, I can answer that in 3 words. Classic Doctor Who. I grew up in the 1970s with John Pertwee as the Doctor, and because he was incarcerated on Earth by the Time Lords, the monsters he fought were on your doorstep. They were here on Earth, so you had giant maggots coming out of slag heaps in Wales, and the sea devils rising up out of the ocean, and Lovecraftian entities that would possess shop room dummies and dolls and bring them to life, and it was wonderful. A million miles better than the PC woke gender flip box ticking garbage that the BBC crap out today and tell us it's Doctor Who that's lost 60% of its viewers and all of its merchandise sales for the sake of scoring woke brownie points. Doctor Who back in the day, back in the 60s and 70s, was genuinely weird and terrifying, and it was as much about horror as it was about science fiction. And that's what got me fascinated with weird creatures, because the Doctor sometimes went up against things like the Abominable Snowman and the Loch Ness Monster and things like that. So that got me fascinated in strange creatures. And when I left school, I became a zookeeper. I worked at Twycross Zoo in the West Midlands, where the PG Tips chimps came from, if you're old enough to remember them. And I ran the reptile house there.
I remember them.
One summer, then I went away and studied zoology at university, and one summer I was on Bodmin Moor looking for the beast of Bodmin Moor, and I visited Potter's Museum of Curiosities at the Jamaica Inn, which is sadly now closed. But they had a little magazine in their shop called Animals and Men, which wasn't as rude as it sounded, and I picked it up, and it was published by this outfit called the Centre for Fortean Zoology. And I started writing letters to them, and then I started writing articles for them. Then I became the Yorkshire representative. And the guy that ran it, John Downs, says, when you finished at university, come down to Devon and be the zoological director of the Centre for Fortean Zoology, which is this organisation that searches for mysterious animals all over the world and publishes books about it and publishes a magazine and runs a conference. So I moved down to Devon expecting this eccentric guy, John Downs, to be some sort of eccentric millionaire living in a mansion, and found that actually he was living in a talk-to-down a house on a council estate that owed more to the young ones than the X-Files. And I joined the CFZ And the rest is history. Since then, I've been all around the world looking for strange creatures like the Mongolian deathworm and the Tasmanian wolf, the giant anaconda, the yeti, the orang pendek, everything else like that. Now, these days, John lives on an old cottage in a little village in North Devon. I still live in Exeter. I still work for the Centre for Fortean Zoology, and I still hunt mysterious creatures.
Awesome. So there's plenty that I want to ask you about, but I guess I attended the Lapis conference last year, and you gave a talk that I didn't want to miss just based on the title alone, which was Jeff the Talking Mongoose. And I mean, saying them words, I mean, we talk about a lot of weird stuff, a lot of weird things. Like we started the podcast 2.5 years ago, and there's things we talk about now that I never thought we would have talked about. I think this has got to be up there with just strange sentences. It's just a weird sentence. And obviously, I know sort of kind of how it comes about. So I listened to the conference, which was awesome. You and is it Jackie? You presented that conference with. So you want to tell us just a bit about Jeff the Talking Mongoose, and because you went over to the Isle of Man to sort of investigate the story. Give us some background on the story, and then what you came across in your investigation.
For a second crack at it. Yeah, well, in the 1930s, a guy called Jim Irving, together with his wife and his daughter Vori and their sheepdog Mona, moved from Liverpool, where he was a furniture salesman, moved to a remote farmhouse called Casham's Gap on the Isle of Man. And they lived in this remote house, which had no electricity. The lights were all either candles or oil lamps, and it was heated by fire. And I'd actually been to where it once stood, and it's still the backside of nowhere and then some. Now, when they were there, sometime after they moved in, poltergeist activity started to happen. And as with a lot of, I'm sure you're familiar with how poltergeists work, it's almost as if they're reading off a script. Sometimes it starts with a scratching sound in the walls, like some sort of animal. Then there was strange, high-pitched vocalizations. And then these vocalizations started to sound more like words, as if it was a baby copying the language of the family, the words the family used. And then it began to string these words together. And then very quickly, it formed sentences and seemed to become more intelligent day after day, very, very quickly. And then it introduced itself. It said its name was Jeff, which is spelled G-E-F, Jeff, and that it was the ghost of a mongoose who had been born in Delhi in India in 1852. Now, this mongoose would speak to them and have conversations with them, and occasionally they would see it and they would describe it as being yellow in colour with a long bushy tail and strange little paws that look almost like hands. And it was something like, it's like a weird thing created by Jim Henson's Creature Workshop. But they weren't the only ones that reported it. Other people who visited the farm heard the creature speaking, and at least one of the people saw it. And Jeff would say that he would go down to Peel, where the bus station was. He'd ride on the buses invisibly and spy on people and bring back all the gossip to the house. And he would sneak into the flats where the bus drivers lived and give detailed descriptions of the inside of their flats, which turned out all to be very, very accurate. And there were questions raised about Jeff in Parliament. He became like a media sensation of the time. He was in all the newspapers. He claimed to be the eighth wonder of the world. And many psychologists like Nandor Fodor, parapsychologists like Nandor Fodor, visited the area. Nandor Fodor heard him speaking. He didn't see Jeff, but he heard his strange high-pitched voice. Harry Price visited there, to which Jeff said, oh, what's that Harry Price? I don't like him. He puts the kibosh on the spirits. I'm out of here. And he refused to come back to the house whilst Price was there. I believe Rollo Ahmed, the occultist Rollo Ahmed, also visited and heard Jeff speaking. And Jeff was around for the better part of a decade. And people have suggested that it was the daughter Vori using ventriloquism. But often Jeff's voice was heard when Vori not only wasn't in the house, but wasn't in the vicinity. And people have suggested it was a conspiracy between Mrs. Irving and her daughter, because they didn't like living in the Isle of Man, to spook Jim so badly he would move back to Liverpool. Well, it wasn't a very successful endeavour if that was the case, because the eyes of the world were focused on Casham's Gap, and Jim loved it, and they got visitors from all over the world. Now, eventually, when Jim passed away, the family moved back to Liverpool, and Vori herself, I believe she moved down to Cheltenham and got a job with a aeronautics firm, and she was tracked down. She only died in about 13, 14 years ago. She passed away at quite an old age, but she was tracked down and interviewed, and she said, yes, this was real. This little animal did appear in the house, and it spoke. And I said, but I wish you'd have left us alone, because, like, in a way, it ruined my life, because I never got married, because how could I tell my husband and his family about things like that? And when she was a girl, she was called the Dalby Spook, because all the other kids took the piss out of her for living in a haunted house with a ghost mongoose. And she said that this ruined my life. Now, if this had been a hoax and they found her as an old retired lady, why is she still keeping up the pretense? And if you're going to invent a story about a ghost, and this is something I've seen in a lot of these hyper weird, high strangeness cases, you'd make up something more believable than a talking mongoose. Now, after the house was abandoned, it still had a reputation for being haunted. It was only torn down in 1971. And the workmen there were convinced there was something strange in the house, and they heard odd scrabbling noises and weird voices and things. And it still had the reputation of being haunted until the time it was torn down. I visited there, and I stopped in a remote farmhouse several miles away from it, and it's quite a trek through. If you didn't know where you were going, you'd never find it, through fields and lanes and stuff, and nothing remains of it now except a well, a bit of old drain pipe, and Mrs. Irving's gooseberry bushes, which we tried to take cuttings of, but they didn't live. So we were planning to camp out in the site of Casham's Gap all night, but the field was full of excitable cows with calves that were thundering everywhere, mooing at the top of their voices and getting distressed. So we decided we'd probably get our tenants trampled. So when you actually get to the site, there's not much to it anymore. It's very underwhelming. So we are heading back to the Isle of Man in July of this year, and hoping to do a series of seances, because I think what Jeff was a tulpa, a thought form. He was a subconscious gestalt of the family that had manifested in the form of this weird little animal. Now, in a lot of other haunting cases, you get strange little animals turning up. Jeff was the most extreme case, and he was the only one that really had a personality. And I think that's because of the amount of attention he got. But the Epworth Priory haunting of the 18th century, their ghost, which funnily enough they named Old Jeffery, manifested as a headless badger that crawled out from under the bed and made scratching noises. There was a haunted house in Cheltenham where both the children and their father saw an animal that they said looked like a hare with short ears running on its hind legs, and the children nicknamed it Wolfie. And the man said you could hear it coming because of its feet slapping on the floor. And dozens of people saw this strange animal, which appeared in the midst of a poltergeist case. And there's another case of a haunting where these creatures like large horned, black horned toads were seen emerging from under the bed. So weird little animals turning up in haunting cases is far from unique. But Jeff was the king of them all.
I don't even know where to start with that. So when Ash mentioned Jeff to me, I was like, what? What the hell is that all about? And obviously I started looking into it, and I'd never heard of like a poltergeist case or a haunting case where animals have been involved. And now you've just mentioned quite a few.
There are far more.
Which is something I definitely need to look into now, because we cover off the UFO topic as well, and a lot of people tend to see animals as part of, or in the abduction cases, as part of like screen memories, and people see owls and stuff like that, giant owls. So, like you mentioned, a mongoose. Why would somebody make up what is ultimately probably the most unbelievable animal to have? A mongoose. Wouldn't you make up like a dog or...
Yeah, a demonic black dog. Yeah, which, by the way, have been seen alongside UFOs and even coming out of UFOs. Demonic black dogs have been seen coming out of UFOs. And in the famous Todd Morton case, the policeman, when he was taken aboard the craft, remembers, amongst the things he saw in the craft, a huge black dog. I write about all this in my new book, which is not out yet. We're just waiting on the cover art for it, and some of the internal illustrations. It's called The Highest Strangeness, because generally I write about straight cryptozoology, which is the study of mysterious animals, which are just animals that are unknown to science. But in this book, for the first time, I dip my toes into the deep weird with monsters, ghosts, UFOs, and miscellaneous phenomena, and look for common threads throughout them. Now, a book you absolutely have to read, and you can pick it up on eBay and Amazon and stuff. It was published, I think, in 73 or 74. It's a book by F.W. Holliday called The Dragon and the Disc. And it's about the links between lake monsters, ancient dragon legends, and UFOs, and he believes they are all part of the same overall phenomenon. And he, in this book, examines how people who've seen the Loch Ness Monster suffer terrible bouts of fear, seemingly unnatural levels of fear when they see the creature, and that strange balls of light and odd-looking lights in the sky are also reported around Loch Ness and other areas where these lake creatures are seen. And it's his belief that they're not flesh and blood animals, but they are a paranormal entity that was once known as the Dragon. And there is another book called Devil Hunter by Mark Alexander, which covers the exorcism of Loch Ness, because the Reverend Dr. Donald Ormond in 1975 actually exorcised Loch Ness because, along with F.W. Holliday, he believed the Loch Ness Monster was an evil supernatural dragon. And he carried out an exorcism in Loch Ness at the 4 points and in the centre. Obviously, it was unsuccessful because people still report the Loch Ness Monster. But both books are a fascinating read, and they're a gateway into this whole weird world of high strangeness and the connections between them. For example, there are cases of Bigfoot, big hairy monsters, being seen alongside UFOs many, many times, and you're probably familiar with that. But there are also cases where they turn up in the middle of hauntings. There's one case from the 1930s in Australia about a farmhouse being haunted, And in the middle of the haunting, the door bursts open, and in comes a Yowie, the Australian wild man, grabs a woman by her feet and tries to haul her off. There are a couple of cases from the USA. One about a night watchman at a brewery in the northwest of the country who saw a looming, hairy entity, very like a Bigfoot, inside the brewery, but it would be like standing behind him, and you'd see it reflected in glass. And when he turned around, there was nothing there, and it seemed to be acting more like a ghost. The Epworth Priory case I mentioned earlier with old Jeffrey, another thing they saw was this hulking creature with red eyes, which today would be identified as a Bigfoot. There's another case about a haunted house where this Bigfoot-like entity would just walk through walls. Now, I think that there are real flesh and blood unknown primates in the world. I think the Orang-Pendekis Sumatra is probably a ground-dwelling orangutan, completely unknown to science. I think there's a huge ape, an upright walking ape, in the forests of Tibet and the Himalayas and other parts of China and Malaya that we call the Yeti and the Yeren and various names like that. And I think there's something similar living in North America, and in parts of the former Soviet Union and Russia, we have this more man-like creature called the Almasty, which may be more closely related to Homo erectus, maybe a relative of one of our own ancestors still surviving. And the Russians took it so seriously that in the time of the Soviet Union, they had a commission to look for it, a government-backed commission to look for it. But there also seems to be this other phenomenon where big hairy creatures turn up that are not flesh and blood. It's almost as if it's mimicking them. A good analogue would be demonic black dogs, which are seen all over the place. Just about every county in Britain has a tradition of a black dog. Huge black dogs with red glowing eyes are still reported today, and black shuck, the bargess, things like that. But there are real big black dogs as well, real flesh and blood big black dogs. And it's similar to that. People see phantasms that look like human beings, but aren't, but there are flesh and blood human beings. And it's as if whatever this phenomenon is, it mimics things.
So, kind of talking about Bigfoot there, you mentioned obviously all different ones from around the world. What's your take on the many sightings of a similar creature in the UK? Do you think it's possible that we've got something here that resembles a Bigfoot type creature?
Well, the main proponent of that is an attention-seeking nut, and has been exposed as an attention-seeking nut. But people do see these hulking figures. My friend John Downs saw one at Bowlam Lake. Now, you're not going to get this is a country park of about 100 acres, 30 miles from Newcastle city centre. You're not going to get a race of unknown 7-foot-tall ape men living 30 miles from Newcastle city centre. Britain is a small country. It's one of the most deforested countries in Europe, and the most depleted of wildlife, and the most overpopulated. There are about 65 million people living in Britain. There's nowhere for a creature like that to hide. But the thing that John said he said it looked two-dimensional. It looked flat. He described it as looking like a human-shaped hole in reality, and it was moving very fast, almost like a speeded-up film, running backwards and forwards. It's obvious that what he saw wasn't an animal. It was something paranormal. And I think the stories of a Bigfoot-like creature in Britain, the ones that are on the level, are something paranormal.
So you mentioned about Bigfoot being seen around UFOs and UFO activity. Do you think it's possible that whilst this kind of creature couldn't sort of be wild in the UK, that it appears and comes out of portals or from a different dimension like a UFO may do, and it travels interdimensionally, so it appears and then disappears, for want of a better phrase. But that could be why we don't have we have multiple sightings like a wild man, but not the terrain like you mentioned, and shrubbery and trees and forests to be able to support like a network of these kind of beings?
Well, there are two main theories that I propose in my book. One is that all of these creatures, well, I don't mean all cryptids, but all of these strange creatures that aren't really cryptids at all, that seem more, for want of a better word, more paranormal. All of these are part of what I call the global monster template. Now you'll see, if you look through legends all over the world in every culture, you'll see the same types of monster turning up in the legends of all cultures. Almost as if there's a rule book and these things will always turn up. You always get dragons and monstrous reptiles in every culture on Earth. They go back at least 40,000 years, and call them what you will, they turn up in every culture, cultures that never ever met. They're the great-great-granddaddy of all the monsters. Forget about demons and vampires and zombies and werewolves. The dragon is more ancient and powerful than all of them. You always get these monster reptiles. You always get these hairy giants in every culture, these man-like hairy giants. They would have been called trolls in Scandinavia, but you get them everywhere, from Australia to South America. You get monstrous dogs, not just werewolves, but demonic black dogs and analogues thereof. You get monstrous big cats. Now, I'm sure some of these are flesh and blood animals, and indeed they have been captured. In Britain, a puma was captured in 1980 in Scotland. I've seen kills by something in Britain that resembled big cat kills I examined in Africa. And we've got hair from, so we know, but some of these seem very strange as well. Some of them, once again, there seems to be a paranormal analogue of a flesh and blood creature. Then you get reports of the Fae, fairies, little people. And I don't mean sort of the Disney-fied things with Daphneus wings like Tinkerbell. And fairies were thought to be dangerous and something to be feared in medieval times. But you still get reports from all over the world, in every culture, of goblins, pixies, duendes, things like that, elves from all over the world. And in Iceland, for example, on Ireland, they still take it very seriously, as they do in Latin America. You get stories of monstrous birds, the thunderbird of North America, the roch of Middle Eastern lore, the owl man, and these winged entities. Now, I was wondering, why do you get all of these creatures again and again in every culture? And it was when I was in Thailand I came up with this idea. I was there making a documentary about monstrous snakes called nagas that are reported from the Mekong River. And I was in a sculpture park, and they had, because it's nominally a Buddhist country, but there's cultural cross-pollination, so they have a lot of Hindu deities there as well. And they had the naga, this monstrous crested snake, and huge statues of it. They had Hanuman, who's like the monkey god, the wild man. They had a Singar, which is a type of mythological lion that's supposed to live in the jungles of Asia, even though the only Asian lions are from the more arid areas of Western India. And they had the Garuda, which is a creature half man and half bird. And I thought, blimey, this could be Cornwall, where they've got Morgar the sea serpent, they've got the mysterious big cats, and they've got the owl man of Morn and Smith. And that's when I got to thinking, why are these things repeated again and again and again? Now, if you cast your mind back and imagine you're on the plains of East Africa a couple of million years ago, our Australopithecine ancestors are coming down out of the forests because the climate's changing, it's becoming drier, there's more savanna, and they're exploiting new food sources like carrion. So they're moving out onto the savanna, and they are going to be preyed on by crocodiles, pythons, big raptors like the martial eagle, leopards, lions, African wild dogs, and they will be in competition with other primates, because there wasn't just one type of Australopithecine, there were several, some smaller, some larger. And there was also Deinopithecus, which was a giant baboon, as big as a man. And it's almost as if these creatures that are reported today are like distant echoes of the things that were either preying on us or in competition with us in our distant evolutionary past. Now, if you've ever wondered why villains wear black and why evil is associated with black, it's because at night we fear the dark. Outside of the little ring of firelight around your campfire, and Australopithecines didn't even make fire. Fire wasn't even invented until Homo erectus was the first, or Homo habilis. There's a bit of controversy there. Homo erectus or Homo habilis were the first ones to make fire. But at night, you're at a disadvantage because predators like leopards can see wonderfully in the dark when you're effectively blind. And that is why we fear the dark, because it's full of monsters. And it was literally full of monsters back for our ancestors on the plains of East Africa. And have you ever asked yourself in buildings that have more than one story, why are bedrooms always upstairs? It's because we feel safer, because they climbed into trees at night to sleep to avoid predators. And these same ancient fears are still with us in the collective subconscious. Now, there was a theory by Rupert Sheldrake about something called morphogenic fields. And that was like a collective subconscious for species. And he noted that somewhere in Britain, sheep had worked out how to get over cattle grids by curling themselves up in a fluffy ball and rolling over it. And suddenly, on the other side of the world, sheep started to do it. Then all over the world, sheep were doing this. It was almost as if they had subconsciously, as a species, shared this information. And he came up with this theory called morphogenic fields, where there is a collective subconscious of a species that shares information. Now, if there's any truth to that, these fossil memories, these ancient fears of ours, could manifest possibly as unconscious thought forms, but thought forms powered by the fear of not a few people or a single person, but an entire community or an entire species, the entirety of mankind, which is why we get the same monsters again and again and again, because they are ancient terrors that would have frightened our primitive ancestors. Now, there was a guy called, what was his name? Frenek Kluski. He was a medium that was around in the early part of the 20th century, just before World War One. And he was Polish originally, but he came over to Britain. And his particular shtick was manifesting animals at seances. And the things he would manifest was an enormous black dog, a great lion-like cat, a huge bird, and there's a photograph of this thing that looks like a nightjar sitting on his head, and an ape man. It's as if he was tapping into the global monster template. Stan Gooch, the parapsychologist Stan Gooch, also at a seance many years later, I think this was in the 60s or 70s in the Midlands, when a creature like an ape man manifested at that seance, this hair-covered creature squatting there, but it wouldn't react when he spoke to it or anything, whereas the things manifested by Kluski seemed to interact with people. So if a medium can do it, the subconscious of a whole species, mankind, could manifest these things all over the world in different cultures everywhere. Nick Redfern, you know the writer Nick Redfern? He does a lot of UFO books. He's a very prolific friend of mine. He was contacted by a guy once who said that he thought there was a cult performing ritual magic around Cannock Chase in the Midlands. And his father was a farmer, and he'd found sheep slaughtered and arranged in very weird ways. And Nick went to meet him in a pub, and he gave him this incredible story that at first is very hard to swallow. Now, at the same time, there have been sightings of strange creatures in Cannock Chase. There have been sightings of something like a werewolf, a huge hair-covered bipedal creature with a wolf-like head, and creatures very like Bigfoot. Now, funnily enough, if you look at werewolf legends, medieval werewolf legends, they're nothing like the werewolves in Hollywood or the quote-unquote werewolves we see today, that people report today. A werewolf in legend is a human that transforms entirely into a wolf, which is indistinguishable from any other wolf, except for maybe weird behaviour. And usually it's through a pact with the devil, or a curse, or being given a magic belt by a sorcerer, or a wolfskin coat, and you'll transform into the wolf to do your mischief. So they're nothing like the wolf-human hybrids that Hollywood has. But weirdly, and I think this is important, the werewolves reported today look like Hollywood werewolves, because I think that's what people expect them to look like, and that's what they look like. These things are being reported around Cannock at the same time. It seemed to be some sort of ritual magic going on. Now, this guy that talked to Nick Redfern, he said he had uncovered this cult, and he had called them the Cult of the Moon Beast. That was his name for them. They didn't call themselves that, but it's a catchy thing. So Nick went with it, and he said that they were a small group of occultists who would manifest monsters through black magic, and they would manifest these great serpentine beasts and creatures that look like werewolves and creatures that look like Bigfoot, and they would send them out to frighten people. And he said that they would be paid to have people frightened to death by these things, because it would look like the person had a heart attack. There was, no fuss, basically. And he said that when these things first manifest, they look like balls of light, and then they take on a form. Now, all of this would sound like a load of old cobblers, something from a Hammer movie, if it wasn't for certain details in it. I mean, Nick talked to him once and never saw him again. The phone number he gave for him didn't work, the contact phone number, so it could be that this guy was spinning a weird yarn. But the odd thing is that balls of light are seen alongside other phenomenon all of the time. There was a Bigfoot case from, I believe it was Ohio, in the 1960s, or beg your pardon, the early 70s. It was 1973, in fact. 1973, for some reason, was a really weird year. It all kicked off in 1973. The floodgates of Fortean weirdness were just booted wide in, and somebody said, "Party, free beer, smart-looking women," and everything come charging in. There's no other year in my researches like 1973, and I've never been able to find out why. But 1973 was just bizarre. And there were a series of UFO sightings alongside Bigfoot sightings, and they were investigated by a guy called Stan Gordon. And if you read his book, Secret Invasion, it's all about that and the links between the two. But in this case, there was something that was killing chickens on a farm, seemingly breaking into, with immense strength, breaking into chicken coops and tearing the chickens to pieces. And the people shot at it, and it wasn't harmed in the least. And it would run through mud without leaving tracks, and it would seem to pass through bushes like a ghost. But at other times, it seemed to manifest as a ball of light. And there are other cases where people, very similar cases, where people have tried to photograph a Bigfoot-like creature, and all they get is a ball of light. There's another case where a Bigfoot was seen holding a ball of light. There's another case from Tajikistan where a Bigfoot type creature was seen holding a ball of light. Balls of light have been seen in poltergeist cases and hauntings. They've been seen with other strange creatures as well. And you get other things like sounds like a baby crying in hauntings and in Bigfoot sightings. Sounds like falling rocks or running water where there are none. And these things are like a thread that runs through hauntings, UFOs, monsters. So there's some link to all of it. So one of my theories is that some of these monsters are being manifested unconsciously by the collective human subconscious. And it doesn't mean that they're not real. They're just real in a different way. They're physical enough to attack people. They're physical enough to leave traces. They're physical enough to kill livestock, things like that. The other theory is that some of these things are, as you mentioned earlier, interdimensional. Theoretical physicists have considered as many as 18 different dimensions. And in many magical traditions, there are different planes of existence, like the etheric, which is a plane just above ours, where they say there are many spirits that can be brought down into our plane of existence by ritual magic, or can come by themselves. Now, this is all semantics, really. What one person would call a demon, another person would call a Bigfoot. What one person would call the astral, another person would call another dimension. It's just what we call it. Now, I've been told independently by two Muslims I know that spirits they believe in, which are called the jinn, where we derive the word genie from, that are supposed to be made out of smokeless fire, which you could translate as energy, come in a variety of forms, and guess what? Some of them look like dragons, some of them look like giant birds, some of them look like huge apes, some of them look like massive red-eyed dogs, and some of them look like huge black cats. The global monster template again. So whether they're being created by our subconscious, or they're coming of their own accord from some other dimension, or they're being brought from another dimension by ritual magic, or manifested from the subconscious by ritual magic, they seem to exist, and they've always been with us. And in my book, I trace this back hundreds of years, hundreds, and sometimes thousands of years. In ancient Babylon and Sumeria, they talked about creatures like this, exactly like the things that we're seeing today. And if you look at UFO lore, it doesn't make any sense that they're aliens. I was looking at something online the other day, and it was about the Hopkinsville Goblin case, which has always been one of my favourites, the Kelly Hopkinsville Goblins, with the little goblin-like creatures around the farm. And this guy, he called aliens the intergalactic bogeymen, because he says they build these craft, they come light years from other stars, just to scare people, just to turn up in farmhouses in the middle of the night, or frighten people and mutilate some animals and go away again. And if they're intelligent beings from another world, they're not making any sense in what they're doing. What they're doing seems to be more like what ghosts do, just scaring people. And another thing is that the main types of alien, and there are quite a few, in inverted commas, different types of alien reported of different shapes and sizes, but the main ones, like Greys and Nordics and what have you, they suffer from what I call the Star Trek syndrome. Because if you look at aliens in Star Trek, they're just people. They're people with, Klingons are people with, men with beards. And then you've got Vulcans, who are men with pointed ears. And then you've got the Androgons, blue men with antennae on their head. They're approximately 6 feet tall. They have 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, 2 arms and 2 legs. Something that evolved on another planet would probably resemble nothing on Earth whatsoever. which is one of the many reasons I prefer classic Doctor Who to Star Trek, because some of their aliens look really goddamn freaky. But also, if you look at it, all it is an updating of fairy lore, because fairies were supposed to kidnap people and take them away, and the people would think they'd only been gone a few minutes, and they'd come back when hours or days had gone past. So there's this sort of loss of time, like there is in UFO cases. Fairies would put little silver pins behind people's ears to stop them remembering, like supposed alien implants. Fairies would want to interbreed with humans because their bloodline was getting weak, and sometimes they'd swap human babies for changelings, which is like this whole thing about greys hybridizing with human beings. It's all just set pieces being moved. If you imagine a play and they just rearrange the furniture and the set pieces and the costumes, it's the same thing happening, only in the modern age it's flying saucers and aliens rather than fairies taking you to fairyland. Although fairies are still reported today. You get these weird cases that are hybrids, like the mince pie Martians of Rowley Regis in the Midlands. Do you remember that one? 1979. A lady and her dog. Her name was Jean. I can't remember her second name now. But this was all over the papers when I was 9 years old. And there was a woman in Rowley Regis in the West Midlands. It was close to Christmas time. Her son had gone out to work. It was quite early in the morning. She was there with her dog when this spaceship with a scorpion-shaped tail lands in the backyard, totally unseen by the neighbours. The door comes open and in float a number of little aliens that have wings like the Disney conception of a fairy, which fairies in actual legend didn't have, and strange waxy little faces and pointed hats. And they talk to her and she offers them mince pies and they examine the Christmas tree. But then when she lights up a cigarette, they freak out, they're frightened of the fire, and they run away, get back in the spaceship and take off again. Which is like a hybrid between UFO lore and fairy lore, with a heap of saccharine Disney nonsense in it as well. But the odd thing is, why would they be frightened of a cigarette lighter if they were from a civilization that had a technology to build a spaceship? And the same thing happens again and again. The Cisco Grove case, where the bow hunter was hiding in a tree and he saw the spaceship come down, the strange aliens with the goggles, and the weird robot that shot up sleeping gas into the tree from its mouth. And he was shooting down arrows at it. He said when he set fire to things and threw them down, both the aliens and the robot seemed to be frightened, and they'd move away from it, and the ship, in inverted commas, would move away as well, as if they were all part of the same thing, and it had some fear of fire. Why would aliens be frightened of fire? None of it makes any sense if you look at it as these are extraterrestrials. And it's the same with most ghosts, not all of them, but with most ghost cases. They don't make sense as spirits of the dead. Now, if spirits of dead human beings could come back all the time, everyone would be doing it. They'd be coming back to their families and saying, oh, don't worry, yeah, I'm dead, but I'm all right. Yeah, I'm in the next dimension or heaven. God's a great bloke. If you've got a lousy haircut, he'll never laugh at it, and he'll always share his beer. They'd be doing it all the time. And you'd have slaughterhouses full of dead cows looking around confused and stuff. But if you look at ghost lore, it's so strange. And these what manifest are mostly nothing like recognisable human beings. I mean, there are cases where recognisable human beings have been seen, but they're in the minority. There's a wonderful case from South Africa in the 1890s about a poltergeist case where a girl kept getting her hair tied to the old-fashioned brass bedstead. And a group of men decided to investigate, and they all sat round a bed in chairs and switched the lamp off. And she started to scream. They switched the lamp on, and a strand of her hair had been tied up. So they untied it, switched the lamp off again, and they heard her hair rustling. They switched the lamp on again, and they saw something invisibly tugging at her hair. Then all of a sudden, the entity manifests. You think a talking mongoose is weird? This ghost manifested as a giant floating glowing crab. A giant glowing crab.
Like you do.
Guys,
That'd be scary.
another case. I mentioned Doctor Who earlier, and my favourite Doctor was John Pertwee. He's always been my favourite. Tom Baker's a good second, but John Pertwee's my favourite. Don't mention Jodie Whittaker, or I will kill you. When he was a boy, it would have been in the 1930s, he used to stay with a school friend in a mansion house in Sussex. And it was a very well-to-do family, and he said he'd go and stay with them, and they were all great musicians, and they could all play things, and he always felt left out because he had no musical skill. And one time he went to visit them, and his friend's family had other guests, so he had to stay in part of the house that wasn't usually used. And he overheard his friend's mum and dad talking, and the mother says, "Are you sure he's going to be all right in that room?" And the father said, "He's a heavy sleeper. It won't bother him." So he went to bed wondering what they were talking about. He woke up in the middle of the night and was assailed by a foul smell, and he likened it to a rotting sheep. And it was so bad it made him sick, and he was sick on the bedclothes. So he took them through to the bathroom, washed them, and put them on a boiler to dry overnight. So in the morning, embarrassed about being sick, when they asked him if he was all right, he said yes, he was fine. And the father said to the mother, "I told you he'd be all right, he's a heavy sleeper." So the next night, he wakes up again, and he's assailed by this same smell, but this time he sees what's making the smell, and he describes this thing that he sees as a tree stump that is glowing green, crawling along on its roots, and its bark is seeming to produce these weird bubbles of light that bubble up from its bark and then just vanish. And the whole thing stinks like rotting flesh, and it's crawling very slowly towards him, and he just freaks out and runs out of the room. And the mother and father have this huge row, and the mother says, "I told you should never have put him in this room." And that part of the mansion was locked. That wing was locked and never used again, and he never found out what it was. Now, in his biography, it's called Moon Boots and Dinner Suits. He describes this, and he describes the house. He doesn't name the house, but he describes what it was like, and that it had a minstrel's gallery, and that it was had an Elizabethan dining hall. And it was added to later. I've never been able to track down the house. But once again, why something so weird? Why not the ghost of a monk or a grey lady or something you'd think of, but a ghost tree? And that's not the only time ghost trees turn up. There are all sorts of strange ghosts that behave in a way that suggests they've got nothing to do whatsoever with the souls of dead human beings.
Strange truths often strange in fiction with some of these things. Like, say, you couldn't, like, why would he say some of these weird things? Like going back to the Mongoose from the very start. Like, he was born in India in like 1852. How did he end up in the Isle of Man? It's just like, you wouldn't really. Why would you make these things up unless it was true? It's really, really weird.
And there's
Weird aspect to it. I wanted to ask, because it's quite local to.
Yeah, far away.
So I was wanting to ask, sort of going off topic a little bit, because this is quite local to me, but the monster of Martin May.
Oh yes.
Which is a supposed lake monster, and you've investigated that. Do you want to just talk about what? Because I live in Manchester, Greater Manchester, not too far from Martin May. So we're interested to hear a bit more about the monster of Martin May.
Oh yeah, the monster of Martin May. And Martin May used to be England's biggest lake, but it was drained for farmland in medieval times. And what's left of it is about 2 acres, a pool of about 2 acres. It's not terribly deep, but it's part of a wildfowl reserve. And we heard stories about something the size of a car being seen swimming around in this lake and attacking swans and geese and pulling them under and devouring them. So I found this a bit hard to believe. So we rung up and we talked to a guy called Pat Wisniewski. Sadly, he's passed away now. He was the chief warden. And he said, yeah, there is something here. I've seen it. So we decided to come up and investigate. And he invited us up. And we talked to him. And he said he saw something the size of a settee swimming around in the lake. And we talked to twitchers who had seen, bird watchers who had seen wildfowl being pulled under the water by something. Now, I took a look at this lake and how small it was and how shallow it was, and I thought, there's no way there's a big predator in there. Half an hour later, I saw it. And I was walking near the bank, and then maybe 6 to 10 feet out, this huge sausage-shaped, blacky green thing like a massive draft excluder came up briefly out of the water, thrashed around, dived under, came up again, and then dived under again. And it was a huge Wells catfish. The Wells catfish comes from Eastern Europe and Western Russia, and it was introduced to Britain by the Acclimatisation Society. There was a guy in charge of Queen Victoria's fisheries who was part of this outfit called the Acclimatisation Society. And he and his colleagues would get foreign animals and try and acclimatise them to Britain. And one of the few ones that worked was the Wells catfish. And he introduced them, and the Acclimatisation Society introduced them into Britain. But this was an absolute monster of a one. It was about 8 feet long. Now, if you didn't know about Wells catfish, if you didn't know there was a big Wells catfish in this lake, you saw that thing, you wouldn't know what the hell it was. It would be a monster. But of all the investigations we've done, and I've been all over the world chasing all sorts of creatures, this one garnered more interest than any other. We did about 500 interviews with newspapers and radio shows as far afield as Australia and India and Canada, and it got into the papers. And when our investigation finished, they wanted us to go back up again to film something for television. The film was looking in the lake again, just for a piece for television. This was just a big lake, a big fish in a small lake. That's all it was. But for some reason, the media got hold of it and they ran with it.
Interesting. It's funny that, like you say, sort of the ones that are kind of you think would be nothing get picked up, and then the more where you think that's something to this is really weird gets ignored. It's kind of a weird paradox. Going back to sort of Doctor Who thing, there's a paradox in the media, that sort of stuff, where they will focus on something and that'll go viral, that'll get publicised when you have like lots more evidence of something really unusual, and then it just gets overlooked. It's a shame really. But something that's probably has got more evidence to it, because you've been to Sumatra quite a few times. I guess looking for the orang pendek, which is like a small version of the Bigfoot type creature. So what is it about that keeps you going back to,
how close
to
it
Sumatra?
is to being discovered? It is very close to being discovered. This is no kind of supernatural bogeyman. It's a real flesh and blood animal. I've been over there 6 times now. I've found its footprints, its handprints. We've found its hair, and the hair was examined by Lars Thomas, a Danish biologist, who, looking at its structure, said it's related to the Sumatran orangutan, but it's not the Sumatran orangutan. It's something that's related to it, that's distinct, and it's an unknown species of primate. I've heard the damn thing calling. The last time I was there, I heard it calling from about 30 feet away, and missed seeing it by seconds when I tried to film it. One of my colleagues, Dave Archer, a few years ago actually saw the creature squatting in a tree, and it got down out of the tree and walked away on its hind legs. So I'm absolutely positive the creature is there, and it's just a matter of time before we get it on film. And what we've done this time, our native guide, Dali, we've left some cameras with him for him to put up in these remote places in the jungle. and just leave them there for months on end. See what we get. We think it's a ground-dwelling relative of the orangutan, whereas orangutans live in the trees. This is one that's adapted for walking on its hind legs on the forest floor. And new species of ape are not unprecedented. As recently as 2017, a new species of orangutan called the Tapanuli orangutan was identified in Sumatra. So new species of ape do turn up.
Thanks. Hope you find something soon. I mean, what's it like when you're sort of in the jungle? When are you camping out there? Are you going like sort of day expeditions into the jungle? What's sort of the process when you're out there?
We camp into the jungle. We go into deep jungle and we make a base camp, and from there we go out every day into the jungle. We used to go to a place called Karinchi Sablak National Park, around an area called Gunung Tujuh, the Lake of Seven Peaks, which is this mountain lake in the caldera of an extinct volcano. But the park authorities have started charging people now astronomical amounts of money to go in there with cameras, because they realise that there's something there and that Western scientists are interested in it. So they're all this, aren't they? So this last time, we concentrated on jungle areas outside of national parks, but we generally make a base camp, identify a good area, make a base camp, and then take trips out every day, trekking in the jungle, putting up camera traps, looking for footprints and handprints and so forth. I absolutely hate camping. I do it because I have to during expeditions. Why people do it for pleasure, what pleasure they derive out of camping, God knows.
Sorry, I was going to say something. If you ever, so when you're in the forest and you're camping, it's obviously, especially in these countries where there's lots of mad creatures, like ones that we know exist that are dangerous. Like obviously being in Britain, we're quite lucky that we don't really have any sort of wild creatures that are dangerous compared to other countries. What's it like, sort of that side of it? Or if you're in your camp and do you hear things walking about? What's that sort of side of it like? Where you think, I'm in the middle of the jungle here, like quite vulnerable?
Not last time, but the time before.
That you sort of get used to? Or?
Not on my last expedition, but the one before. I was up at Gunung Tujuh, and around this lake there's one small area, a small beach where you can camp, because the forest goes right the way down to the water everywhere else. But there's one small area you can camp, and there's a trail leading off into the jungle. And we'd been there quite a while. It was our last night in the jungle, and we built a big fire, and we were in tents, and the native guides were in a pondok, which is a thing they create out of wooden sticks and palm leaves. And this little trail leading up into the jungle in the dark, I got a terrible feeling of being watched. I could feel eyes on me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. And I remember saying to the two other Westerners there, there's something along that trail there and it's watching us. I know there is. I've never felt like this before, this sense of being watched by something. In the morning, when we were tidying up and breaking camp, there were fresh tiger tracks there, and a Sumatran tiger had come down, stalked us, and then seen the fire and stopped. And in the last expedition, one of our camera traps we set up, we didn't get the orang pendek, but we got a Sumatran tiger on it in an area where there are not supposed to be any Sumatran tigers, which was fantastic.
Well,
been attacked by a cobra in West.
Scary stuff.
But I used to be a zookeeper at one time, so like I say, I've worked with all sorts of weird animals: crocodiles, alligators, snakes, lizards, elephants, giraffes, penguins. The worst thing's been dirty and vicious are chimpanzees. But I've never been worried.
Horrible little things.
Yeah, well, we've been covered in leeches. The second time I was in Sumatra, 3 of us around a campfire one night pulled 100 leeches between 3 of us off our legs. I've still got the marks all these years later. I've had ticks all over.
No, thank you.
Wow.
In the Gobi Desert, when we were hunting for the Mongolian deathworm, in one area we got ticks all over us. We've had
Not selling it to me.
all kinds of tropical diseases. And some people say, oh, they just do this because they want expensive foreign holidays. Yeah, right.
If only.
Been soaked to the skin in a storm in Tasmania when we were hunting the Tasmanian wolf. Absolutely wringing wet through. I twice nearly fell off a mountain in Russia while we were looking for the Russian wild man, the Almasty, in the same day. Once I was walking on what I thought was solid ground, and it was just ice above a crevasse, and it all gave way. Another time, a part of a cliff crumbled away when I was on it. I've nearly been swept away by rapids, also in Russia. Russia had it in for me. Russia tried to kill me 3 times.
Wow. Lots of adventures anyway. It sounds
We've talked about
that's the luxurious side of
all
it.
this with these weird things, but most of my work has been simply looking for unknown species of animal that are real in the same way that you and I are real. Things like the Tasmanian wolf, which is also known as the thylacine, which is a flesh-eating marsupial that looks like a wolf or a dog, has tiger-like stripes along its hindquarters. It's a case of convergent evolution where 2 completely unrelated animals evolved to look like each other because they're living similar lifestyles in a similar ecological niche. And this thing looks like a wolf or a dog. And it was supposed to have been hunted to extinction in the 1930s, but there have been over 4,000 sightings since then, including ones by a park ranger and a zoologist. And along with the orang pendek, it's thought to be the cryptid most likely to exist. And I've been over there and I've talked to witnesses. I've talked to a guy who's employed by the government to go out and shoot feral cats, which are a bloody pest and a menace. He's seen it twice in the wilds of Western Tasmania. We talked to a guy who ran an arboretum, and he said he was in a car with his wife, and there was another carload of people behind him, and he saw one of these things running along the side of a road, trying to get under a barbed wire fence on a farm, and 2 carloads of people saw it. Another guy said he'd seen it in the 1970s. Once again, there were 5 of them in a car going to work. They'd worked at a hydroelectric plant. And so this thing came out into the road in front of them. They all got a damn good view of it. And the people that were familiar with it when it was still around said that it had a very distinctive smell like a hyena. Because a lot of the old Bushmen were in the Boer War in Africa, and they'd met hyenas. They knew what a hyena smells like. I know what a hyena smells like. And I got that hyena-type smell in this remote forest in the west of Tasmania, as if the creature had just crossed the forest path a few moments before, and it left this lingering odour in the air. Its continued existence has even been predicted by computer programs. There was a guy called Professor Henry Nix who developed a computer program called BioClim, and it was meant as a research tool. And you would program in everything you know about a geographical area, everything you know about your target species and its preferences, then match them up, and it would predict where the animal will be found within this geographical area. For example, if you were looking for white rhinos in Botswana, it would predict what's the best place to find white rhinos in Botswana. And he tried this with the Tasmanian wolf, and he found out there was something like a 98% match between where the BioClim program was predicting they should be if they were still alive and where people were reporting them from. So it's almost certain the Tasmanian wolf is still alive.
Wow. We've covered so much ground on this episode today. I don't even know where to go. I could speak to you for hours.
How about
So
the
I think we're gonna have to
deathworm? The horror of the Gobi Desert. Now,
go on.
the nomads in the Gobi Desert talk about this creature called the Alroy hoi hoi, which is They call it translates as intestine worm. They say it's this long red worm-like animal with scaly skin that comes up to the surface after the rain has fallen. And according to folklore, it can spit a corrosive yellow saliva that acts like acid. And it can also produce blasts of electricity like an electric eel. And the first Westerner to look for it was the paleontologist Roy Chapman Andrews, who they based Indiana Jones on, although he was a paleontologist rather than an archaeologist. And he was over there in the 1930s. I went over there in 2005 and I travelled 1,000 miles through the Gobi Desert. And I talked to about 24 witnesses, and they all described the same animal. They said it was about as thick as your arm, 2 to 3 feet long, sausage shaped, reddy brown, scaly, and most of them had just seen it basking in the sun, and they were so frightened of it that it could throw a whole area into a panic. There's one guy we talked to who had seen it as a boy in the 1930s when he was tending his family's camels and goats, and he told his parents, and they were so scared that they packed up the gur, which is the circular tents they have, and moved out of the area. Another guy had seen it just the year before we were there, and he'd seen it at an oasis, and he managed to get it on the end of a long stick and pick it up and described it to us. We talked to an old retired army colonel who had seen one in the borders of China in the desert near the Chinese border, and he thought it was an old piece of tyre lying in the desert until he got close to it, and he said it had dew on it, on the scales on its back, and it was glistening, and he thinks that's where the idea of the electricity comes from. Most people we talked to didn't believe that it could make these blasts of electricity. They thought that was folklore, but they believed it could spit this corrosive poison. And we spoke to about 24 witnesses that all described this same animal. And I think it's not a worm at all, it's a burrowing reptile. There are a group of reptiles called worm lizards, or amphisbaenas, which are not snakes and not lizards, they're a little group in their own. And they're very poorly studied. And they're sausage-shaped things. To be honest, they look like big cocks more than anything. If you look at worm lizards online, you'll see they look like big scaly cocks. We think it might be a large undiscovered form of worm lizard, or failing that, maybe an undiscovered form of sand boa. And most of the powers attributed to it are probably apocryphal, because you get this sometimes. You get strange powers or folklore growing up about an animal where they attribute it with strange powers. They used to think that gorillas would tear branches off trees and use them as clubs to fight elephants, and they'd carry off native girls and rape them, and of course they don't do any of these things. There's a snake in the Sudan called the apris, the local people call the apris, and it's a form of sand boa. They believe it's so deadly that it doesn't even have to bite you to kill you. If you so much as touch it, you'll drop down dead, and they're terrified of it. And it's completely harmless unless you happen to be a mouse. Completely harmless. So I think a similar thing has happened with the death worm. These stories told about it are apocryphal, because nobody saw it killing anything bigger than a mouse, and nobody knew anybody that had been killed by it. They just knew old stories of it spitting at people and killing them. So sometimes strange stories go up like
fascinating.
Exaggerate the creature.
Yeah. For sure. On that note, I think that's
Oh, you've got enough. Okay, yeah, I could talk all night.
so I was going to say, yeah, definitely do a part 2. I think that's last. I mean, like I say, just absolutely tons and tons to go through. But yeah, we'll.
An old farm after the wild man roaming around outside in Russia, but we'll save that for next time, maybe.
Definitely. So, where can we find? I know you've written quite a few books. Where can our listeners find you or your books?
Well, my two latest, my new book, The Highest Strangeness, isn't out yet, but the last two are called Adventures in Cryptozoology and In Search of Real Monsters, and you can order them off Amazon. Just type in Adventures in Cryptozoology and or In Search of Real Monsters, and you'll get them. That's sort of an introduction to cryptozoology and an overview of some of my expeditions. If you want to look up the website, it's www.cfz.org.uk. That's the Centre for Fortean Zoology. And my own email, if you want to contact me, is Dr3UK at yahoo.com. That's Dr3UK at yahoo.com. And we're always looking for sponsors for our expeditions because, as it stands, we can afford to go out maybe once a year for 2 weeks to 4 weeks, depending, when in reality we want to be going out to these places and staying there for months and months on end, because that's how you find these things. We found with the camera traps when we tested them in England, if you leave them up for a week, you might get a bird. If you leave them up for several months, you get foxes, deer, badgers, otters, woodpeckers, and a woman having a piddle in the bushes. That's all the things we got when we left them up for a long time. So we need to spend more time in the field. That's how you're going to find them. With the snow leopard, for example, when they first went out to try and find the snow leopard, it took them something like 7 years to film a snow leopard in the wild, and that's an animal we know exists. So if you think about something like the Yeti, which is an intelligent animal that doesn't want to be found, it might take you a lifetime to be found, or it might never be found. But it's all down to the folding green stuff. That's what we need.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Richard, for sharing the wealth of knowledge, and good luck going back to the Isle of Man in search of Jeff, the talking mongoose. Hope you get something from that trip.
Yeah. See if we can reinvigorate him. Cool. He's a tulpa. They can be recharged.
Definitely. Well, yeah, thank you, and we shall speak soon, I hope, and have a good evening.
Cheers.
Thank you.